Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Ann Peters from the Pulitzer Center, and we'll get started here in a few moments with today's conversation with our first Breakthrough Journalism Award recipient, Victoria Mckenzie, a freelance investigative journalist. As we wait for more folks to join us today, please let us know in the chat where you're listening in from. For those who have not been to a Pulitzer Center event before, we wanted to tell you a little bit about us. The Pulitzer Center is a nonprofit journalism and education organization based in Washington, D.C. We support more than 170 reporting projects each year on global and local issues. On our website, you can have a look under our reporting issues page where we bring together this work by themes, including on racial justice, indigenous communities, the environment, migration, public health, and assorted other issues. We have developed a strong university program connecting journalists with college campuses, and we also award reporting fellowships each year to students from our university partners, now more than 35. On our K through 12 education front, we reach thousands of students and educators via class visits, online sessions, professional development workshops, and we organize public events and webinars such as this one. It's wonderful to see so many folks joining in today. We see folks from St. Petersburg, Florida, Brooklyn, the Bronx, Zurich, Switzerland, Maryland, University of Michigan at Ann Arbor, and Orlando, Florida. A few logistics that we wanted to let you know about. We'll start today's session with opening remarks by Victoria, and afterwards I'll come back with my colleague Naomi Andu to speak further with Victoria, as well as to take time for your questions. You'll see a Q&A icon on your screen. You can begin adding your questions at any time during the remarks, so when something comes to mind, please go ahead and do so. We'll use the chat icon specifically for technology issues. Note that all attendees are muted, but if you can't hear us at any time, please let us know via the chat function. We also wanted to let you know that we'll be recording today's session to post it online for others who could not join us today. And one final logistical note, please remember to stay online once this session ends to participate in our brief survey. Now I'd like to introduce our speaker. Victoria Mckenzie is an investigative journalist based in New York City, covering issues of criminal justice, public sector corruption, and international development. Her work can be seen on CBS News, Vice News, The Crime Report, Columbia Reports, the Associated Press, and other media outlets. Last year, Victoria was the first recipient of the Pulitzer Center's Breakthrough Journalism Award. This award is made possible through the generous support of Eva Lohr, and it seeks to recognize and celebrate the achievements of Pulitzer Center-affiliated freelance journalists. The Pulitzer Center is now accepting submissions for the second annual award, so please visit our site to learn more. Victoria's Pulitzer Center-supported project, Nowhere to Turn, investigates the high rate of sexual violence against Native women and girls in remote rural villages of Alaska, and the frustrations over what community members call an ongoing legacy of indifference from authorities. This reporting is sensitive, and we want to note that at least one image Victoria will share is graphic in nature, so please be aware. Now I'd like to hand over the microphone to Victoria.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure and also an honor to be able to speak with you and with so many people from around the world today. This story, I wanted to pull back the curtain a little bit and bring you kind of a look at the reporting that went into a story in which was really told by a couple of people when it was published. You heard the voices of, I think, 3 different women. But in fact, I interviewed over 100 people, not just women. I interviewed over 100 survivors of sexual assault and abuse. And not only that, but historians and tribal healers and public health officials, other kinds of medical professionals, criminal investigators. So it might not be apparent in this story, but there are a lot of people behind it. And a little bit about the geography. I did narrow down the scope of the original project to something that I felt like I could handle on my own. And that means it it took place in the jurisdiction of Nome, which is a city of about 3,400 people sitting right on the edge of the Bering Strait, on Bering Sound. Nome is about half of its population is Alaska Native, a little bit more than half. And there are about 25 Alaska Native villages in the surrounding area that use Nome as a hub for different services. Like it has the region's only hospital. It has just the supermarkets, the bar. Villages are dry, by the way. There are a number of different rules applying to each different village. In some, it's illegal to have alcohol. Nome has a front street that is lined with bars, and right behind it is the Bering Ocean. And it's off the road system, which is something that I had to look up while I was planning this trip. It means there are roads in Nome, but they're not connected to anything outside. You can get to one village by snowmobile if you're lucky. I've known people personally who set out and became lost and never came back in the winter. So one thing that I really would like to emphasize is how much, just looking at over at my Alaska hard drive and all of these photographs, how much the physical environment seemed to reflect what I was trying to get at there. And this is why. It's a place where rumor and legend are almost more than real. And some of that's intentional, and some of that is very skillfully used by authorities when they want to cover something up, hide it, obscure what the truth. So as I set out to this place to compare reports of abuse and assault versus arrest outcomes versus prosecution outcomes, I landed and I quickly discovered that, wow, some people, in fact, many people I spoke with did not even have a police report. They reported to the police, but there's no evidence that the police took a report. So my data became watching people request the records. That's part of the data I was collecting. So instead of doing all of this data analytics, it's kind of like looking around in Nome in the winter, where you can't see the ocean, you can't see the ground, it's all snow and ice. And I had a real uncertainty as to what lay beneath. So you have medical files like that have been lost or destroyed that I discovered. You have this kind of constant erasure. Okay, let's pause for a second. That needed a disclaimer, sorry. We can move on from that image, but what you just saw was an image that was published by the city council on their website, and it was submitted and circulated among the city. And it was a photo of two women lying on the ground unconscious with their clothes removed from the waist down. And this is right outside the visitor center. And the context of the photo was, doesn't this look bad for our tourists? This photo's published and circulated right before I went to Nome, after I'd already begun to put the project together. And for me, it's the emblem of why I needed to do this. It was answer to a call from community members to me who asked me to look into what was going on. It also kind of speaks to the kind of numbness that a community that has become very used to certain things, anyway, we all do. We become a little bit blind to what's around us, but this was something that was quite disturbing. And yeah. So what you're seeing here now, just streets in Nome, what it looks like in February. In order to get anywhere from Nome to Nome, from Nome to any of the villages, you have to fly in a small single engine airplane. So I did some reporting in Nome and I did some reporting in the villages, each of which is very different. And that's one thing I wanted to also bring in here is if you're reporters tuning in, medical records became part of my data that was very important. And part of that reason is because working in a small town, you don't want to kind of kick the door down and ask for a bunch of records, public records right away, necessarily. So what I did was just talk to people about what happened to them, what their experiences were, put together a timeline, trying to still with the same goal of seeing where things break down in the system. And part of that was getting their medical records, and that was incredibly illuminating. I don't have time to get into, this is basketball, people. Basketball is extremely important. I will come back to that in a second. But yes, we don't have time to get into the whole issue of medical records and what they can tell you here. But they did speak to the importance of medical responders, whether those are ER physicians, first responders, or just general practitioners. Those are an important record, important data, but it also belies some of the same biases that you would see in the police department that we focused on in the publication. So I hope if there's one thing that you take away from this today for reporters is that be willing to take a fresh look at that. If you're reporting on criminal justice, it's a very interesting, medical responders have a very interesting role and consequential role. And so don't know how long I've been talking, so maybe, Anne, you could let me know where we are.
Sure. I know you have a few more highlights to give. So if you have some continued remarks, and then we can get into some
Sure,
more
great.
conversation.
Now, actually pay attention to some of these photos. I was just trying to talking so I wouldn't get too out of the off my train of thought. So this is in Ulu, what we're looking at right now. We're inside, interiors in the winter are so important. And this is the village of Shaktoolik. This is Bun's mother, and Bun became the defendant in a federal lawsuit after my stories were published against the city of Nome, and hopefully to overturn a precedent. But this is her mom, and the neighbors came over with some trout because everybody shares their catch. Everybody shares, if they catch a moose, they've got fish. She's an elder, so of course, people are sharing their catch with her, and that's a traditional cutting tool, just not just used for food, but it's also used in crafting. So. And this is the Unalakleet Airport. And Unalakleet is one of the larger villages. In fact, you go, it's very much like a bus, these little planes. They are also the school bus, very literally. That's the only way you can go to and from places. And basketball is very important because in the winter, kids get to travel for their games. So Unalakleet, the kids from the Unalakleet team would pile onto their school bus single engine plane and fly over to the next village. This is the Lady Storms. This is the St. Michael Storm basketball team. And we had a great time with them. Very cheerful. Everybody turns out for the games. Everybody in the village turns out for the game and cheers. And it's like just the lifeblood of winter there. So, and the kids sleep in the school. There's just, and in fact, so did I. If you're visiting a village, there's nowhere else to go. So, although I stayed with Bun in Shaktoolik, this is St. Michael, and I was sleeping in the counselor's office on a cot. So. That's some happy images here. This is Flo. That's me saying goodbye toward the end. Flo was a very important person to me because and to many people, she was the key witness in a trial of a police officer for the murder of a young Native girl in 2003. And then the year that I went to Nome, she had been assaulted by a police officer who was fired, but then rehired about a few weeks later. So a lot of things were happening here. She had become kind of come on hard times and was homeless and with the people you saw standing on Front Street. There's a lot of people who are unhoused. Housing shortages are a serious thing in a place where you can't there are no trees, it's tundra, and you have to fly materials in just by airplane or by ship. So it's a big issue. Touched on a lot of things, but I'd like to invite you to reach out to me if you're working on something that, and you have some questions for me. I'd be happy to help. I know it's a little bit too much for a short conversation. So thank you very much. And yeah, ask me anything.
Thank you, Victoria. One of the questions that I think journalists, and one of the questions that have come up, Kimberly Brown has asked one about self-care, and it was one of the ones top of our mind as well. You were in the field for 3 months, 100 miles from the Arctic Circle, reporting on an extremely emotionally charged subject. So what was the most challenging part of the reporting process? We'll start with that, and then we'll follow up with Kimberly's the self-care aspects. So what, as far as the reporting process?
The reporting process, again, I think lack of privacy, you wouldn't know it. In this vast tundra, lack of privacy in the winter, it was a big issue. I would have to go up to have a conversation with my editor. I would sometimes like duck out to literally to like stare at the Bering Sea, and then the phone would power down because it's -35 out. So that was one big issue with the reporting. And really navigating those, you want to keep an open line of communication with everybody when you are there. It is not like some, international investigation. You're in a small town. You want to keep the conversations going. You do not want to alienate people. That doesn't mean like lying or being manipulative. It just means like keep your mind open, have a little bit of that unconditional positive regard that sometimes attorneys talk about. For the people you're interviewing, and a bit of a suspension of disbelief, just and then I left, and then that's when the public records requests came. So in terms of the emotional issue, that was really the biggest challenge. And I thought, oh, I've done work overseas, I've reported in a war zone, I'm tough. And there were a couple of things that were so different about this. And one was that, well, I think this was my first project that I spent so long on gender violence, and that was very difficult. I'm reporting on women, and I'm a woman, I'm very aware of my own vulnerability, perhaps. The other issue is that we're talking about conditions that exist in my home, my country, where I was born. And that was a tremendous, I was not prepared for how that would affect me. I suggest anyone that goes out to do something like this has a very strong support system before they leave. It's ideal if you're a freelancer to have 2 people at least in the field. I think this would, I had the privilege of having a very talented photographer there for the final week, but I was there for 3 months. If it's at all feasible, have someone else there. Just, it's better for the reporting too. But don't underestimate how things might affect you. You need, and wait before it becomes an emergency point. And I just want to drop in there that afterwards, I was dealing with a lot of very difficult topics and people who were dying. I mean, I had many sources die, and sometimes self-inflicted harm. There's a Facebook group called Trauma in Journalism, or I think it's Journalism and Trauma. And there are Achberg Fellows, which is part of the DART Center. And this is, I've heard about the DART Center, but this was really kind of like first aid, people who reported on tough stuff, much more so than I had. And they responded right away and we were able to talk about it. And I think that's what you need, is people who've gone through it. Because in the end, reporters were really tough, but we need the support of our colleagues. And that's the clincher. Mhm.
And we also wanted to know, as a journalist who is from outside of the community of Nome and who isn't Alaska Native, what steps did you take to ensure that your reporting on this marginalized group of Alaska Native abuse survivors was sensitive and didn't feel like parachute journalism?
Yeah. Well, I before I even put the proposal together, I talked with so many groups in Alaska. So I took my direction, from what they were saying they needed, what kind of reporting they said they felt they would be helpful, and what kind of reporting in the past had been harmful. For example, reporting that, oh, in Nome you can get away with you can get away with rape and nobody cares. And if you've published one story to that effect, I mean, it actually kind of has the effect of attracting predators too. So they had felt, I sat down and I listened a lot, I'll put it that way. And it was just important for me to talk about the process of reporting and what that's like, because one thing that I think the public doesn't quite understand is how little control a reporter has over a headline or over publication timing and things like that. So you want to constantly manage expectations from the beginning. And that's, I mean, that's it. And, I followed what Lisa Alana, who was really, she did everything there. She was the one who put this whole group together with Laverne Ashenfelter, and this was a survivors group that became an advocacy group that really pushed for change. She said, please just come and stay with us, spend time with us. So that's what I did, kind of went through it whole winter there. So, and I'll have to say it was a fight to the very end to make sure the words were correct, because you're working, if you work with a global media company, my editor didn't have control over everything. So it was a fight, and hopefully, it nudged things a little bit in a more accurate direction.
Perhaps you could walk us through something a little bit before. So Amanda Paul asked, how did you originally come across the story? And how would you recommend looking for and going after such types of stories that are, as she says, so important, yet deal with sensitive topics and vulnerable populations?
Yeah. So you're going to confront all of your own assumptions, which I did, and that's just going to happen. So when we go after these stories, it's just be ready to change your mind. So, for example, what part of listening to other people I was hearing was, and I personally just kind of felt tired of the way we choose quote unquote victims and who gets to tell the story. And sometimes that leads to kind of cherry picking sources. So let me backtrack for a second. Could you repeat? There were a couple different questions in there, and you had.
Sure. And I know I should never do multiple questions.
Okay.
So I'll just read in part what Amanda had asked, was basically how did you come across the story?
Okay.
How did you first learn about it?
I listened to National Native News, and that's part of Kiwanis Broadcasting System. have a 5-minute broadcast on. So I was just in the shower, I was listening to this story about this group in Nome, in Alaska. I didn't know what Nome was. And there was a group of Alaska Native women who were saying that their cases of sexual assault were not being prosecuted and investigated at the same rate. So yeah, that's it. That piqued my interest. I spoke with the news director, and we had talked about a lot of different stories, but then I asked him what he wanted to pursue, and without my mentioning it, he said, you know, there's something weird going on in Nome.
Mhm.
And then the second part, I think, had to do with how do you handle the sensitive.
And how would you recommend continuing to look for such stories, you know, that have sensitive topics and also working with vulnerable populations? How might you, it sounds like you had been listening and just had your ears open and mind open about this, but how might you also recommend for others?
I think you follow your curiosity, but I think we don't want to to assume who is vulnerable and who is a victim. So that, I think that's probably why I responded in the way that I did. There were a few words I began to just, start Xing out of my vocabulary. And I think resilient actually became one of them, like the language around resilience and the language around really like kind of a victimhood. So I would just, if vulnerable population starts, I know we use it and that's our raison d'etre, right? But I don't, just keep your eyes open. I mean, it could be anyone, it could be you. I mean, elders, people, older are vulnerable too. We all are in some way or another. So my other point would be to not conflate necessarily justice and criminal justice. And I got a lot by asking people what they felt justice meant. And I come out of traditional crime reporting. We talk about the justice system. It's a thing here. It's a cog, but maybe not assume that increased sentencing outcomes is what everybody wants. So we just kind of those are a couple of things. But feel free to contact me too if you have other questions.
And Victoria, in my conversation with you for the Pulitzer Center Q&A series Behind the Story, you really emphasized how much of your reporting didn't make it into the final product. So I was wondering, what was your approach when you were deciding what to keep and what to cut?
My approach was to act as a defense attorney for everything that I wanted and fight and fight and fight and fight until like 4:01 in the morning. And that was my approach. And I lost a lot of my cases there. So no, but I did realize that I got so close to this, obviously living there and being so immersed. This is, immersive journalism, that I had to trust my editors to some point. So you do have to pick your battles. It's exhausting. And I tried to, I did feel though, because there weren't other women in, making editorial decisions, I did really, really feel, I don't think my sources and the stakeholders necessarily knew how, for example, how much I fought just to get some Inupiaq words, the correct Inupiaq words in, and the tribal affiliations, all of that language correct, and not try to,
We have a question from Millie Legrin, who is focusing on the records. So Millie asks, were there, and what challenges you had in getting those medical and police records? So I will start with that first part.
Right. Well, the medical records were the easiest because they belong to the sources. It's their records. And they were very illuminating. And for one person, I had 2 boxes of records. And but the difficult part was the police records. And I believe it was because they didn't take they didn't produce a report half the time. And there were also some cabinets that had been lost or trashed somehow. So that was the biggest difficulty. And then I still want to get this information, but there's to get them really find out what went wrong. You want prosecution's statements back to the police why they declined a case, because that could mean the police officer was on a no-fly list because he is a liar. It could mean that it wasn't a good case. It could mean, oh, we didn't believe the victim would have be good in front of a jury. It could mean so many different things. I did not get those. The state of Alaska said it was under attorney-client privilege with the state being the client. So, but I do want to get them. Yeah, so really the medical records were the easiest to get.
In an earlier conversation we had, just going off of that, you were talking about the issue of the response of the medical community, whether that's the individual the paramedics who come, or if the person, instead of calling 911 to have paramedics come, they make the report to the police. Do you want to go into a little bit about that in terms of how that impacted some of your reporting, or what you might want to do later on with this work?
Oh yes, so I see them as just as important as police here, because often the police are not the first to respond to an assault. So Nome is very different in that it actually has a 911 system, and not all of Alaska has 911. So the calls go into the police department where the 911 operator answers, and that's like the lowest position of anybody who's working in that. People start out there and then become officers. And that person makes a decision whether to call an ambulance or a police officer. So I spoke to one woman who had three different been violently assaulted 3 different times. And she, in recounting her stories to me, she would just over and over ask, would it have made a difference to the case if I had been brought to the hospital in an ambulance instead of a police vehicle? The ER doctor, I mean, I saw some very egregious things myself in the ER before I was kicked out, but it was the ER doctor, you're completely at their mercy. They may not call an assault nurse. They may decide that you're intoxicated, and that's the problem. I've seen medical records that show that this person, who later on turned out to have even life-threatening injuries, was not even given an X-ray. You can read the language in the report to see there's a lot of stuff around alcohol in the language. It really becomes this chattel almost. This is kind of like prosecution of alcohol. I feel like this inanimate object that means much more than it actually does. That makes sense. I don't know. So that's where I would go. I really would want to talk about alcohol and the ways it's kind of code for a lot of different things, and how important, how consequential those doctors and those first responders are in criminal cases, as witnesses, as forensic reporters. And
we have another question from the audience. Yelena asks, what was it like to get people to talk to you about these difficult topics?
oh, that's a great question, because I tried very hard to take a trauma-informed approach based on, I was very influenced by hearing Stephanie McCrumman talk at an IRE conference a few years back. And, I'd done some trauma reporting, but one thing that she said is like, look, this is kind of it, you approach it more as a negotiation. So if somebody is recounting something that's so difficult and so intimate, I mean, you're not calling up a police officer and asking them about, for a statement. you discuss how it's going to go, and then you lead a little bit of a negotiation if they want to change their minds. Or, for example, if they accidentally revealed somebody's name they didn't want to, or some details, you want to manage expectations and then give them some room. And then at the end, like, kind of do some aftercare. You don't just like, so we would kind of bring things back to the present. I spent a lot of time driving around with one person in their truck. We had a lot of conversations in cars because that's the only private place. And privacy was an issue. Personally, that is what got to me, like 15 hours a day of that. I started smoking again. So it was a lot to share. You want to react as a human, but you have to keep all of those confidences in a tiny town where there's no privacy. Everybody is a kind of a source. So you're holding all of that for everybody for a very long time, because it's not just like, oh, let me call, get a comment. I kept in close contact with all of those folks for a year. So it wasn't just the 3 months I was there. They called me anxious about the story for, the year afterwards. So.
And that's on a practical note. You were there for 3 months, this lack of privacy, lots of hours of conversations. And Kimberly from our audience asked, how did you keep track of all this information and the people telling you these stories on a daily basis? So specifically, did you record your conversations? Did you carry a notebook? Did you, what was your process?
Oh gosh, well, so it wasn't just how I keep track of things, it's how does this editor at AP and then this news producer or this radio producer at a radio show, how do they process information and how will they hear? So I have my own system. I have Evernote. I love it. I'm used to that. I tag things. I get very excited about, talking about organizations, like how to do things. I was asked to make audio diaries as well. So I did that. Some of them are kind of so tough to listen to. And I wrote reporting memos for the editor. And so I would write, every few days, I would write a reporting memo, kind of keep track of things that way. So it wasn't just keeping track of things for myself. I found that these two very different people from, different mediums received information in a different way. Next time, I'm just going to try to stick with my own way, like make them do it my way.
So what would be your way? What would be your preferred way then?
Oh, just a shared notebook, guys, shared notebook. We have there's so many applications, just choose one and just stick with it. Slack channel. I had a Slack channel, I had Evernote, I had, audio files, I had like my little summaries I had the reporting memos, but then I had the summaries on top of those memos. And then my producer really liked to talk on the phone, which meant repeating. I was not only hearing these stories, I was repeating them for somebody who thought so differently that he needed to hear me say it over and over and over again. So that actually that's one reason that, not just for practical reasons, like you don't, if it's a really tough, violent story, just read the memo too. Guys, yeah.
So it's been over a year since your story's published, and Jennifer from the audience asked, can you talk a bit about the impacts of the reporting?
Yes. Well, I would say it's ongoing in terms of the court case. Very shortly after the second story was published, the ACLU filed a federal lawsuit. And this was on equal protection grounds, meaning that I think this is the 14th Amendment, I believe, equal protection on the basis of race in this case. There's a precedent in Alaska where a lot of Native communities got together and tried to sue the state saying, hey, we're being discriminated on based on race. And it's a very deliberate and, it's part of the system here. And when it comes to policing and public safety, state of Alaska won in their argument saying, oh, it's not race, it's a rural versus urban issue. It's just really, it's a very different and, logistically more difficult to serve rural Alaska. We know that rural Alaska is Native Alaska. All of the rural villages in Alaska are Alaska Native, Inupiaq, Yupik, and several other different language groups. So this is something that it's still going through the courts. I think they're probably past the discovery stage. I know it's been a tremendous thing for Bun, who's the center of the lawsuit. Bun is short, Inupiaq word short for daughter. So her real name is Clarice Hardy, and she was the 911 operator who was assaulted and reported to her supervisor, who then never took the report.
Oh.
And they had been friends. He's also now being sued, but so she's kind of this shouldering a lot of it. I know it makes her very anxious, and she's very brave about it, but it's a court case is a huge deal, and I know she is waiting for this to resolve.
Yeah. I'm going to switch gear just shortly because we do have a number of questions too about the process as a freelancer pitching that proposal, especially to the Pulitzer Center. So have at it on that note, to start with some suggestions that you have in terms of whether time and budget. Would you have, Jennifer from the audience says, would you have asked for more time? Would you have thought about more time spending? But really the process for pitching as a freelancer.
Yeah. I've been doing this. This is the thing I think that comes most naturally for me. I'm like sorting through all the little proposals I've done since college, and in like bus stations in Colombia, and, overseas. It's something that I actually really enjoy doing. I really suggest this advice that was given to me again at IRE, which was like, make sure you have a minimum story too. Just think through everything that can go wrong. Really do that. What if you don't get this data? What is the least story that you can deliver? And I don't know, I love the research. I do a lot of research in writing my proposals. My issue is just cutting them down in size, as I am also very discursive when I'm talking. That's a preparation, pre-reporting, talk to people. And again, I call people for advice. So I'm just going to put it out there too. If you have any other questions, please contact me. I'm happy to help. I've looked over proposals. People, I don't think anybody really looked over this. I was writing it with my editor at AP who I had gone for. So we submitted it together. And yeah. The thing is, like, I kind of remember him being a little impractical with the budget, and I got these little red flags in the back of my mind. It's very expensive there, and I didn't end up having, I didn't budget enough to be able to take a day off or go, for example, our trailer was broken into and someone stole all the guns. Like stuff goes wrong. I needed to go to a hotel for a night. It was the nephew was running around with a bunch of stuff was happening there. People stabbed. I mean, it wasn't an easy place to live. And yeah. So, but, a 2-week trip would end up being expensive too, because then you're paying for hotels, So I tend to always go for more time. They wanted, originally the producer was saying 2 weeks, and I was like, oh, I was thinking of 3 months. He's like, what? Yeah, if I would do anything differently, I would love to go back in the summertime and see it when everybody's happy and fishing and camping and hunting. So.
So Victoria, you won the Pulitzer Center's first $10,000 Breakthrough Journalism Award last year, just after the pandemic shut everything down in March. And I know 2020 was a tough year for the journalism industry and especially on freelance journalists. So what did winning that award mean for you at this point in your career?
Well, it meant so much because I was about to leave journalism, frankly. I had come back almost pretty broken from this project, and financially and otherwise it was really tough. So I really encourage people to reach out to me for, if you are considering a big investigation, talk to people beyond just getting a little tip here and there. It was an enormous moral lift for me, because as a freelancer, again, you submit the story that you've worked really hard on kind of in a silo by yourself for a long time, and then it's just over. And you're like I was kind of in this fugue state, wandering, coming in from this trailer in Alaska, and it meant a lot to be recognized, or to have my effort recognized. I guess that meant a lot to me. And it meant a lot to me when my sources came to me, were very happy for me and thought I deserved that. That was awesome. And of course, I did not do much work in the past year, having lost my parents, and COVID was really rough on my family. So the money was extremely helpful too. But I would say it's so good to have your effort recognized, and it's not something you necessarily get in life, and it's a pleasant surprise.
Well, the reporting is just phenomenal, and if anyone has not yet read the pieces, please read through them. And as Victoria said, there's more in terms of the outcome going forward with this court case. So you have repeatedly told people that they should get in contact with you. Do you have a way for them to get in contact with you, or do you want to share that in a different manner?
Let's see. I'm happy to share my email. Actually, if you have, maybe, is that something that you're able to do in the chat right now? Why don't I just go ahead and share my email, and then afterwards, if you don't happen to catch it, maybe they can write to, or tweet at me. I'm on Twitter, or I'm on LinkedIn. So I'm in a fairly receptive state right now. This week is very flexible, so catch it while you can.
Thanks. I think if you could, we can figure those out and make sure people can reach out to us as well at the Pulitzer Center. And if you're amenable, we can put your email in the chat.
One more time, I want to plug the Achberg Fellows. If you or any reporters are just kind of struggling with something, it's freelancers. It's a very isolated experience. It's a very isolating job, So
yeah. So you may not be looking at the chat, but we have a couple of folks who said congratulations, because they're very excited of your efforts, and also on the award. So there is, just circling back to the reporting again for a bit. There is a question from Andrea, who asked, did you ever have anyone who had initially agreed to be part of the story, but then changed their mind?
So the woman who was going to be central to all of the stories, in fact, it was tough. She actually attempted suicide and ended up in the ER and had to retract. So we rewrote it. We had to obviously respect that, because I said, you got to change your mind, and she did. That was tough. I was already back. I was already in the AP offices writing up the story. So yeah, and I hope she's okay. But that's the nature of doing this work, and that's why you do so much more behind the scenes than what comes out. Yeah. Just stick to your promises, no matter, but don't, that's the trope here. Don't make promises, and if you do, keep them. But thank you to everyone.
One other question that we have, again, you were saying don't make promises. If you make them, keep them. Elena asks, in terms of empathizing with your sources, or how do you separate your emotions while making sure you get all the facts and what you need for your piece or pieces?
Oh, separate. I'm like, what's that? Separate. I just worked so hard. I mean, I really kind of like drove myself into the ground here. I just knew that I had to get it done. I mean, and it just goes to the nice things that people say about a journalist, like when you're doing a good job, you get called like a bulldog, tenacious, all that stuff. It can kill you too. So that's why I say make sure you have the people that you can share everything with. The upsetting thing you just saw. And because you also don't want to get in a situation, hypothetically, where one or more sources are worrying about you. So it happened one time. I saw something that was so upsetting during a ride along that I had a source who was like, "Are you okay?" And I was like, "That's not what I want to happen here." So yeah, I just did extra. I think I borrowed from all of last year's energy, and I'm just now emerging from it. Yeah, I borrowed from the future.
Mhm. So speaking of the future, what's next on your plate that you could tell us about, or what are you thinking about?
I've been wanting to go get more into financial crime reporting, and because I think I really feel that it's kind of should be there, not only in with traditional crime reporting, but it should be there like with criminal justice reform reporting, and it's something that's kind of left out of both those like more advocacy reformy type journalism projects and the traditional crime beat. Um, and in the Alaska, I want to go back to. I want to keep following up and keep following up and keep following up. I that is kind of a permanent. Right now, it feels like a permanent haunting, but I'm sure that word will hopefully change.
Mhm.
And that's it. I get back to public corruption and financial crime stuff. Yeah.
So one last question from the audience, kind of pertaining to the aftermath of after you publish these pieces. So Susan asks, what kind of opposition did you expect to encounter when you come across these types of stories, and what do you do when much of it comes from an active prejudice?
I think you don't try to be there and challenge prejudices. That's not your job, I think, when you go in there, because you want to keep, like I said, you want to keep the conversation open. You want people to talk more, not less. So the resistance, did I really get any resistance? Yeah, I got resistance from the police initially, but I think it was because of their misunderstanding of, I just had to make it clear that I was not going to go away, because they are used to, not everybody has like an Alaska budget. It's an enormous expense. So to get there for more than a day is more than most people are able to do. So usually they would, I guess the resistance I would get would be, they would tell me something that they expected I would just believe and not verify. And then I would just hang around. Like, then they're like, kind of like, well, we already talked to you about that. I'm like, so literally going back to the police station every morning at 10 o'clock in the morning, which is still pitch black then, in the winter. It doesn't get light till after 12:30 p.m. And just that's it. Making clear you're not going to go away. The other major difficulty is that agencies that did not have an experience with media would often make an error and in dealing with me, and then and with the photographer I worked with, and then they tend to retaliate after they realize they made a mistake. So it became almost predictable. They didn't really know what their own rules were. They're kind of like figuring it out as they were basically living with us. So but I don't feel I don't feel I got much resistance. There was definitely a huge dose of skepticism and bad experiences with the press in the past. So that was really just, you know, figuring out where that came from. And I mean, honestly, valid stuff. So yeah.
Well, thank you. And given that the sun didn't shine and in the winter so long, so you do have to go back in the summer so that you have more like 23 hours of light to talk to more folks about. The time together has just flown by. We're coming to the end of the hour that we set aside. But thanks to all our participants, we have put in the chat Victoria's email and ways to contact her. And if for some reason you're not able to reach her that way, just reach out to us here at the Pulitzer Center. And we're just so thankful for all of your work, Victoria, and just pursuing all of this and sharing your knowledge with us.
Well,
I really appreciate it.
Thank you for the award, and thank you for listening. And that goes to all of you out there. And that's it. I invite you to talk anytime. Call me up.
That's terrific. And we also want to thank as I mentioned, we have this event and this conversation has been recorded, so we'll have it up on our site. We also want to thank all of our colleagues at the Pulitzer Center, especially Holly Peipenberg, who's our producer for this session and helping us obviously with the slides and so forth. And we appreciate, as I mentioned, all of you in the audience for joining us today. And those of you who are able, remember that we are a nonprofit journalism organization and we do depend on donor support. So please become a Pulitzer Center champion. Remember too, that as a freelancer grantee of the Pulitzer Center, you can check out more information about the Breakthrough Journalism Award. And again, thanks to our donor for the award, Eva Laura, for her generous support in making that possible. We have some more events coming up next week that we wanted to let you know about. Next Wednesday, please join us for the COVID-19 Vaccines Combating Misinformation, an event we're co-organizing with the Howard Hughes Medical Institute. And then on the next day, on Thursday, January 28th, we'll have a conversation with Natasha Alford of The Griot, sharing details on her recently released documentary, Afro-Latinx Revolution, Puerto Rico. And there are more virtual events coming up, so please check out thepulitzercenter.org. Please stay with us just for a few more minutes to take a brief survey after we officially close today's session. Thank you again for being with us, and we hope you'll join us soon again.